Welcome back, this is Gaming Assembled. In today's episode, we are looking at my top 5 roleplay ideas for Crusader Kings 3. One of the best things about CK3 is the depth of the game. The events that happen, the interactions between the characters that come out of those events. You could say that the replayability of the game is in a large degree built on these interactions and on this depth that comes out of the engaging nature of a story in the game. And the idea is that if you play the game in a very min-max kind of way, you can often take away from this. You end up finding that the story that you have becomes stale. It becomes just like your last campaign or just like the next one that you'll do, and they end up sort of all merging together, and you lose sort of passion for what you do. To some extent, I mean, I've heard it time and time again that, you know, players will say, oh, I've never actually made it to mid or to late game, simply because, you know, they've never, the game that they've got going, the campaign they've got going has never kept their interest that long. They've always just thought, oh, I've had enough of that now, and they'll go and do something different. And so this sort of points out the problem that it's trying to find that really good roleplay scenario to go with when you're trying to start a campaign, trying to find something that really catches your interest and not only just keeps you going through that first succession and the second and the third, but keeps you going from generation to generation in the story that you're building with your characters. And so that's what this video is about, trying to look at some ideas for roleplay that you can put into your games to try and really energize them, really make them engaging and add depth, and hopefully make them a really good time. So first up at number 5, we've got the idea of recreating history, and the game is full of this. This is why I've put this as my 5th one. You could play pretty much any character that there is, really. I mean, everything from Alfred of Wessex and Malcolm of Scotland and Charles the Bald of France, and there's various other characters throughout the world. You know, the reformation of Persia and things, in terms of sort of various the Austrian characters and various people. There's all sorts of characters. But the key to it is, of course, in terms of recreating history, is not just, again, playing it in this very min-max, very gamey way. It's trying to look at the characters. What are their traits? What are their motivations? What do they think at this moment in time? What are they trying to do? What are they frightened of? How do they feel about this person that they've encountered, this rivalry that they've got, the situation that they find themselves in? How would they react? Not how would you react, and what's best for the game. And really trying to engage with the character and drive your campaign forward in that way is a really, really different take in some ways. I know that seems really obvious, but it does make a massive difference in terms of the way and the style that you play your game if you actually just do it purely based on what they think, what their motivations are, rather than necessarily how you can get more prestige, how you can get more gold really quickly, and how you can expand your realm more quickly and things like that. Look at it from their perspective, their relations with the characters. The new DLC, the most recent of the DLCs, I think it was the most recent one, where it's all about the rivalries and the friendships and things. This really plays into this side of things, and it's really useful to look at. So that would be my number 5. Recreating history, looking at see if you can re-achieve what someone in history actually did. Alfred of Wessex, obviously he never conquered, he never formed England himself. It was his children and his grandchildren that did that, but he was a fundamental part of it. He formed the Danelaw, set that in motion. He turned the tide back on the Viking invaders. Various other characters, you know, across the world. I mean, you could think about what I used Malcolm of Scotland as another example. Obviously, he in reality never sort of went beyond the realms of Scotland, but he held his kingdom intact, and he formed the foundation of what later came in terms of Scotland. So trying to do these things and trying to do them from the perspective of their personalities and their character traits really does sometimes, as I said, make a big difference. So that's number 5. And then number 4, we've got rewriting history. And so obviously this is where Paradox gets its name from. It's changing the way history happened. And there are lots of examples of this that you could look at. So in the 1066 start in Mercia, there is a character called Edgar who is of the House of Wessex. Now, you'll have heard of him from, I'm not sure if he's in the bookmarks, I don't think he is, but he's certainly a fairly well-known character in terms of the game. But obviously his story was that he was in many respects, he was the legitimate heir to Edward the Confessor, and certainly should have been the next king in many people's eyes at the time after Harold Godwinson was killed. And so the idea was that in reality, he never actually managed that. I mean, if you listen to the British History podcast, you'll know his story quite well. And if you don't listen to that, I would suggest doing so. It's a really, really good retelling of this period in time right now. But the idea is that you can, through Crusader Kings 3, change his fate. You can reclaim the throne of England through him. You can do things that never actually happened in history. But again, doing it with his intentions, his traits and things, trying to look at his ambitions, which were to try and retake England, try to dethrone William of Normandy and become the king. So you could look at things like that. You could look at the Muslims in Spain. Obviously, in reality, in actual history, the Reconquista happened, and the nations that are Spain and Portugal were formed. And but there were many Muslim rulers in that area at the time who obviously could have turned the difference, made the difference and turned the tide if things had gone differently. Obviously, you've got to remember, looking at history as a thing, we are looking back at it with the knowledge of what happened. Now, obviously, the rulers who were there at the time didn't have that luxury. They didn't know how things were going to work out, how things were going to happen. And so changing the way things happened, forming an alliance here where they didn't in reality, or engaging in a battle there, these things can really make a big difference in the long run. They might seem irrelevant might have seemed irrelevant at the time, but now when you look back through the history books, maybe they would have made a huge difference. You could look at the Carlings. In the 1066 bookmark, I think there's only one Carling left. I forget which county he's in, but the idea is that they were once the rulers, basically, of most of Western Europe. And then by the later bookmark, they were, barely anything. They were dying out. And so, again, it's an obvious example in terms of rewriting history, but you can do that sort of thing. You can look at reforming the Roman Empire and things, which again has been done, of course it has. But the idea of doing it from the perspective of the Eastern Roman Empire, what is obviously the Byzantine Empire. They sent the Emperor Justinian sent his famous expedition to reconquer the West. I know that was much earlier than the bookmarks that we've got, but who's to say that later emperors couldn't try and achieve the same ambition, try and reconquer the Western Empire? There's no reason why you couldn't. And so there's loads of things like this, but changing your focus from the scenario that you've got to what if? What if that had gone differently? Number 3, we've got bringing back long dead religions or cultures through creating a ruler. You could look at options that are out there. So, for example, again, I mentioned Rome before. You could come up with a scenario of, in this place, this family has been pretending to be whatever they are, pretending to be Christian, pretending to be French, pretending to fit into the society that they are in, pretending to be Italian. And the idea is that they really are secretly the descendants of this culture, this religion, that's been there just in the background, waiting for its time to re-emerge. And the idea is that by creating this character, you are now the sole heir that has come forth, and it is now time to re-emerge, to bring that culture and that religion back. So the Roman ones, the Brythonic cultures and things in the British Isles and in Brittany. You could look at things like Greek heritage. The Alexander the Great's empire spanned all over what in the bookmarks is now the Muslim world. And, so you could look at things like that. The idea of reforming the Bactrian realms or something of that nature. So one of the successor states, a holdout of that earlier time that has somehow survived through the centuries just under the surface, and now there's a popular movement, there's something happened and has brought that person to power. It's a really good role-play scenario to sort of try and, again, think about their motivations, what they're trying to do, how they would go about doing it, where they would expand to, naturally, trying to think about what had been there before, bringing back what was. And there's loads of other examples. There are loads of other things that you could look at along those lines. But, it really does, again, add a little bit of depth if you try and think of it from that perspective. In number 2, you've got Resurrecting a Legacy. Now, I know that might sound very similar to the previous one, but it's not. What I mean here is, in great stories, you've got victims of injustice. I mean, to talk about something in popular culture now, obviously you've got the things of Game of Thrones. You've got the Starks of Winterfell who've been displaced. They were the ancient rulers of Winterfell, and therefore have been displaced, and they're trying to re-emerge onto that throne, I suppose. Obviously, actual history is full of such things, such as examples. Again, I'm British. I'll think about the British Isles first. But the idea is that you could look at areas like Northumbria. Northumbria as a realm in the Heptarchy was once formed of Bernicia and Deira, sort of two separate countries that were put together. And if you know anything about British history, you'll know that the ruling families in Northumbria, as once it was together, were always at each other's throats. They were famous for this. They were very much the Borgias of that time, in a sense. They were trying to sort of constantly stab each other in the back and trying to regain power. And there were constant fights and infighting, and it's why ultimately they became such an easy target for the Vikings later on. Their realm was just so weakened by infighting and disjointed rule, and in general it was a very dangerous place to be a ruler. You'd got the sons of Ida, who were the original rulers of Bernicia. You'd got other people, other families, the family of people like Edwin of Deira, and various other sort of families over the course of history have had claims on things. And so part of your role play could be that the single county count, for example, in that area is in their mind, the heir to the Northumbrian throne, so to speak. It could be that that's how your focus is for your campaign, to try and re-establish your family in its rightful place, ruling that realm. You could also consider the Vikings, obviously. If we're in the 1066 campaign, 1066 scenario, the bookmark, that's the word I'm looking for, then you can think about them reclaiming their lands. So, the history of that area, and the same in Mercia. There's various kings, various ruling families across time that have been at each other's throats and displaced each other. Different dynasties have come to power and risen and fallen. So the idea is that you can look at restoring a particular family and things, and so that becomes part of your your legend. And if you take it a step further on, obviously in the 1066 bookmark, if it works out that the Normans have won their campaign, if you sort of skip ahead in time slightly, you can look at the idea of reclaiming those lands for the Saxons. If it's an area that the Normans conquer, you can switch character to take over a family that's trying to hold onto their land or something of that nature. There's different things that you can do to really, really play into the story and the characters and their interactions in that regard. Going off the British Isles, you could, again, a very obvious one, resurrecting the legacy of the Roman Empire. There's people like the Armenian Kingdom who were conquered and subjugated many times and sort of rose and fell. Obviously, the idea of Persia. Again, it had a larger past. You think back to Leonidas and Thermopylae and all these types of things, and so it had been much larger in the past, but obviously now not there. So again, you can re-establish and resurrect a legacy of a group, a family, a nation. There's lots and lots of different possibilities that add to the flavour and the story of your game. And that brings us to number 1 in my list, and that's my 0-year-old random roleplay scenario that I like to do as well. And this is something that I've done in my Inheritance series on the channel. And the idea of it is that it really plays into the strengths of the Crusader Kings 3 game and setup. The idea is that you start off as a 0-year-old baby with no character traits, no skill points, just 0, 0, 0, 0 on everything. And the idea is that it tries to add a little bit of reality. These times, no matter which bookmark you're talking about, they were brutal times. People died, people suffered, people didn't quite manage to live through their experiences of that world. And unfortunately, that meant sometimes that both parents might die, and it would be the scenario of this game that a baby has inherited the county of whatever. Dad has died in the fighting, mum has died in childbirth, something of that nature, or obviously diseases were rampant then. It could be a disease you want to go for as your backstory. But the idea is that regardless of how it's happened, this little baby has now come into the world and has inherited immediately the realm of dad or mum. And the idea is that all of a sudden now the council, who are randomly generated, they have randomly generated traits and characteristics and personalities and things. They are the people who are in practice raising this child. And the way that I do this scenario in terms of roleplay is that once I've set the game up and set it going, before I even unpause, I start by looking at this council. Who are these people? What are their character traits? Who would naturally step forward and say, I'm going to be the guardian of this child? Someone on that council would step forward as being the prominent person who was going to look after and raise that child and shape them. And how they would shape them would depend on their personality. So the character traits that your character in the game, your 0-year-old character, would gain would essentially come from the guardian that they get at the start. And that guardian, as I said, being based on the personality and traits of the various counsellors who would step forward, who would take the child, essentially. And so it can lead to a very, very interesting mixture of things. You might get a bunch of characters who one might be really ambitious, and so he might want to claim the child for their own ambitions to get ahead. It might be that the person on the council is really compassionate and is really sort of kind and really just would naturally step forward, and that's just who they are. They would naturally want to look after the child, and it'd be about the child's best interest, not necessarily theirs. So immediately just there, between those two scenarios, you can see a completely different way of playing the game. And obviously as the child grows up, obviously there's different traits that come along and different characteristics that they get. And the idea is that once they come of age, the decisions are now theirs. So previously it was all the events, all the decisions that come up are based on the characteristics of the guardian, because they're the one who are in practice ruling the council and making the decisions. They are the Tywin Lannister. I'm going back to a Game of Thrones reference, but they are the Tywin Lannister of the group who are in fact actually ruling. And so the idea is that trying to improve that situation so that they get out of it what they do, that drives their motivations and drives your story along. And so in terms of once the character comes of age, as I said, obviously then the decisions are the characters. But when they have children, they are then making the decisions for their for their children and going from there. So it becomes a never-ending cycle of parental and guardian sort of personality traits that really, really do shape your game. But the fact that the initial councillors are random and their traits are random really just adds randomized flavour to the game every single time. It really makes it repeatable. So that is my number one choice for roleplay scenarios. Those, of course, are just mine. I would love to hear what you think. What are your favourite roleplay ideas? Do you rank them differently? Would you rank them differently to the way I have? And if so, how? What suggestions would you make for your own ideas? Are there ones that you love to do that I've not said? Obviously, comment. Get in touch. Talk to us. It'd be great to hear from you. But when you start a new game, one of the things that really, really helps is if obviously you get off to a really good start. And there are things that I do when I'm doing my roleplay games, roleplay stories, that really help the story to pick up and to add depth really straight from the beginning. And so in my next video, I'm going to have a look at that. I'm going to talk about how I start my game typically with roleplay games, what I do, the simple steps that I take to really add depth and make the story more rich right from the beginning of the campaign, to set my campaign off really, really well and make it really engaging every time. So join me in that video if you want to see how that works. Click on the link at the end of this video and we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.